He hadn't spoken a word in 1,095 days. 3 years of solid, heavy silence. But the little girl who appeared at his fence that morning wasn't there to hear him talk. She was there for the secret he'd buried with his wife. His name was Silas, and his world had shrunk to the size of his ranch, a kingdom of dust and memories fenced in by his own hands. The weathered gray posts weren't just to keep his cattle in, they were to keep the world out. A world that had chewed him up and spit him out, taking his voice along with everything else. He lived in a silence so profound, the only sounds were the wind, the lowing of his herd, and the frantic beating of his own broken heart. Then she appeared. She couldn't have been more than 12. A faded blue dress, braids laced with the dust of a long walk. She gripped the top rail of his fence, her knuckles white, and just stared. Not at the house, not at him, but at the horses grazing in the far pasture. She watched them with a focus so pure it felt like a prayer. Silas watched her from his porch, the coffee in his mug turning to ice. Folks from town, they had stories about him. The crazy hermit, the man who'd lost his wife and then his mind. They gave his property a wide berth, their whispers clinging to his fence line like morning glories. But this girl, she had no fear, no curiosity about the monster who lived within. She just stood there, patient and still. An hour passed. When she finally turned to leave, Silas saw it. A mare let out a sharp whinny not 20 feet from her. The girl didn't flinch. The heavy gate groaned on its hinges as a gust of wind caught it. She didn't turn her head. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole the air from his lungs. The child was deaf. He watched her small figure shrink into a blue speck on the horizon. And that night, for the first time in 3 years, the silence in his house felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was empty. He found himself wondering about another human being. Who was she? Why did she come all this way alone? And why did her silent presence feel like a key turning in a lock he'd long since forgotten? The next morning she was back. Same time, same spot. But this time Silas noticed something new. She carried a small bundle of cloth, tied with a simple knot. She never opened it. She just held it. This became the new ritual. Every day at 8, she'd arrive with her little bundle. She'd stand for exactly 1 hour, watching the horses, her small hands clutching that package. Then she'd leave. Silas watched from every shadow his ranch offered, the kitchen window, the crack in the barn door, the deep shade of the porch. He studied her like a man possessed, a man trying to solve a puzzle with no words and only one piece. But he was watching the wrong thing. He was so focused on the girl, he didn't pay enough attention to the bundle she carried. He thought it was a toy, maybe a snack. He was wrong. It was a map, and it was leading her straight to him. On the 5th day, the mystery became too much to bear. It gnawed at him, a physical hunger for an answer. He saddled his horse, a thing he hadn't done for anything but ranch work in years, and rode toward town. The main street felt alien. People stopped and stared. The hermit was out. Whispers followed him like his own shadow. He found the general store owner, Otis Clay, loading a wagon. Silas knew him from the before times, before the silence, before the world had ended. He pulled a small notepad from his saddlebag, something he always carried, and scribbled a question. "That your daughter?" Otis looked up, his face a mask of surprise that quickly soured. "Clara? Yeah, she's mine. Born deaf. Sharp as a tack, though." "Why?" His eyes narrowed with suspicion. Silas pointed vaguely back toward his ranch. He didn't have the words, written or otherwise, to explain the strange, quiet comfort the girl's visits had become. Otis's expression darkened instantly. "She's been bothering you. I told her to stay away from there. I'll speak to her teacher. She won't be a problem anymore." But that wasn't what Silas meant. He shook his head, a wave of frustration washing over him. How could he explain? How could he tell this man that his daughter's silent company was the only thing that made the days bearable? That she was stitching together the frayed edges of his soul without even knowing it? Otis misunderstood completely. "Look, Ward, I know you value your privacy. I get it. She won't trouble you again." Silas rode home with a cold dread coiling in his gut. He'd done the wrong thing. He'd broken the spell. He had invited the world back in, and the world had immediately tried to take the one good thing he had left. The next morning he waited. 8 o'clock came and went. The fence stood empty. The sun climbed higher, mocking him with its brightness. The silence was back, but now it was a roaring, deafening void. He had never felt more alone. He had driven her away. He was about to turn from the window, to surrender to the familiar gray numbness, when he saw it. A flash of blue. Not by the road, not where her father would be watching. It was in the tall grass behind his property, moving along the creek bed. She hadn't given up. She had found another way in. And Silas suddenly understood. She wasn't just visiting. She was on a mission. Clara emerged from the creek bed, the hem of her blue dress dark with water. There was a new purpose in her stride. She wasn't just watching from a distance anymore. She walked straight into the back pasture, directly toward his favorite horse, a gentle bay mare named Sunset. The horse, instead of shying away from the stranger, lowered her head as if greeting an old friend, allowing the small girl to stroke her velvety nose. There was a language passing between them, one that had nothing to do with sound. Silas watched, mesmerized. It was then that he made a choice that would change everything. He stepped out of the barn. He expected her to run, to be terrified of the silent hermit emerging from the shadows. Instead, her face broke into a radiant smile. She waved, a simple, happy wave that felt like the sun breaking through years of storm clouds. When was the last time someone had been happy to see him? He found his feet moving, carrying him across the yard, each step closing a gap of 3 years. He stopped at the pasture fence, the wooden rails the only thing separating them. Clara pointed to the mare, then to herself, and tilted her head in a clear question. She wanted the horse's name. Silas's hands trembled as he picked up a stick. He crouched and scraped the letters into the hard-packed dirt. Sunset. Clara's face lit up with understanding. She pointed to herself, then used her finger to draw letters in the air, too fast for him to follow. Then she took her own stick and carefully, neatly, wrote her name next to his. Clara. The urge to speak was a physical thing, a pressure building in his chest. It terrified him. Words had failed him at his wife's grave. They were useless against that kind of pain. So he had abandoned them. But this was different. This small, silent girl didn't need his words. She had found a way around the broken part of him. She wrote again, a single word that hung between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of loneliness. Friend? Silas stared at it. His throat was tight, his eyes burning. He reached for his stick to answer, to write yes, to cross that bridge. But before he could, the air was split by the thunder of hoofbeats. Fast, multiple riders, coming straight for the ranch. Clara couldn't hear it, but she saw the panic flash in Silas's eyes. She spun around, her body tense. 3 men on horseback were bearing down on them. The lead rider was Otis Clay, and his face was a storm of fury. Otis reined his horse in so hard it reared back, its hooves pawing at the air. He was on the ground before it settled, his face flushed a deep, angry red. Behind him were 2 other men Silas recognized with a sinking heart. Sheriff Wade McKinley and a woman he didn't know. Clarabelle Clay, you get away from that fence right now, Otis bellowed, the sound useless against his daughter's deafness. But the rage was unmistakable. Clara didn't shrink away. She stood her ground, her small hands clenched into fists, her chin set with a defiance that reminded Silas of a cornered badger. The joy of a moment ago was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. The woman with them dismounted gracefully. She was calm, her movements measured. She approached the fence and began to sign to Clara, her hands a blur of swift, sharp gestures. Clara signed back just as fast, pointing at Silas, at the horse, at the names in the dirt. Even without knowing the language, Silas could tell it was an argument. The girl was defending him. She says she's been coming here to learn about horses, the woman said, her voice strained as she translated for Otis. She claims you've been teaching her. All eyes fell on Silas, the silent hermit, the town crazy. The sheriff's hand was resting on the butt of his pistol, a casual gesture that was anything but. Otis stood with his arms crossed, a human wall of judgment. Silas picked up his stick, his hands shaking, and wrote in the dirt. She visits. No harm. No harm? Otis exploded, his voice dripping with scorn. She's a 12-year-old girl, Ward. You're a grown man who lives out here all alone, hasn't spoken a word to another soul in 3 years. People talk. They wonder what a man like you might want with a deaf child. The accusation was a poison dart. It found its mark deep inside him, twisting in a wound he thought had long since scarred over. He stumbled back, shaking his head, the denial trapped in his silent throat. They couldn't see. They saw something ugly and twisted where there was only a flicker of light in an endless darkness. They couldn't understand that this girl's silent friendship had been a lifeline. Clara seemed to sense the shift. She saw the pain on Silas's face. She signed frantically to the woman. The woman's expression softened. She says you're not like other adults. She translated reluctantly. She says you understand silence. I don't care what she says, Otis snapped. Clara, wagon, now! But Clara didn't move. Instead, she did something that stunned every person standing there. She walked right up to Silas, close enough that her faded blue dress brushed against his dusty jeans. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a trust so complete it was heartbreaking. Then she began to sign, slowly, deliberately. Not to the woman, but to him. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. What did she say, Nora? The woman, Nora, hesitated. She looked from the girl to Silas, her brow furrowed. She asked him not to disappear. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a plea. This child, in her silent world, had seen the truth. She knew this confrontation could shatter him, could drive him so deep into his shell that he'd never come out. And she was fighting for him. But Otis had already made his decision. His face was like granite. Clara gets in that wagon, or I'll have the sheriff escort her. Clara's small body went rigid. She shook her head, a silent, powerful no. She turned to face her father, a tiny warrior preparing for battle, and her hands began to fly, a flurry of motion in emotion. Nora Harrow, the teacher, watched with a deeply troubled expression. She translated, her voice barely a whisper. She says you don't understand. She says this man knows what it feels like to live in a world that doesn't listen. Something inside Silas cracked wide open. This child, this 12-year-old girl, had seen right through the walls he'd spent 3 years building. She saw the prisoner, not the monster. I don't care what she thinks she understands, Otis snarled, his patience gone. Clara, 5 seconds. Then you'll spend the rest of the summer in your room. That's when Silas did it. He walked to the fence, his movements stiff, and he wrote in the dirt, the letters deep and angry. She is safe here. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice a low drawl that didn't match the hard look in his eyes. Safe, Ward. People are starting to ask questions. A man who won't speak, all of a sudden, taking an interest in a little deaf girl. It doesn't look good. The implication was so vile, so far from the truth, that a red haze of fury clouded Silas's vision. He wrote again, pressing down so hard the stick snapped in his hand. Not what you think. But Clara wasn't done. She walked to the fence, climbed onto the bottom rail so she could see over, and reached across the divide. Her small hand rested on Silas's arm for just a second, a brief, warm touch that sent a jolt through him. It was a silent promise. I'm not leaving you. She then turned to her father and signed, slow and measured, each movement filled with weight. Nora's translation was quiet, full of a strange reluctance. She says, if you make her stop coming here, she'll run away. She says she'll find somewhere else where being different doesn't make you a prisoner. The threat was real. They all knew it. The girl who found the secret path through the creek was more than capable of disappearing entirely. Otis stared at his daughter, and for the first time Silas saw a flicker of doubt in the man's eyes. But what nobody understood was that Clara wasn't just running to Silas. She was running from something else, something she couldn't name, a shadow from her past that she felt every time she looked at her own father. And that shadow had led her right here, to this ranch, for a reason she was only just beginning to understand. This wasn't about a lonely man and a lonely girl. It was about a crime. And the truth was buried somewhere on Silas's land. The sheriff, Wade McKinley, shifted uncomfortably. He was a man who liked simple problems, and this was spiraling into something messy. Otis, maybe we should just take a breath here. The girl's just being stubborn. But Otis Clay wasn't a man who backed down. Pride was etched into the lines on his face. My daughter doesn't make the rules. Clara, that's final. You're coming home. Silas watched Clara's face fall. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of himself 3 years ago. Trapped, helpless, with the world closing in. The same silent rage that had stolen his voice was now burning in this child. And a dam inside him broke. Without thinking, without choosing, he opened his mouth. He pushed air from his lungs, past a throat that felt rusted shut. A sound emerged, a rasping, grating noise that was barely human. Wait! Everyone froze. The horses, the men, the wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Clara's eyes went wide. She had never heard his voice, but she knew. She knew the magnitude of what had just happened. Silas swallowed, the act itself painful. He forced out 3 more words, each one a shard of glass. Let her choose. Nora Harrow stepped forward, her teacher's intuition on high alert. Mr. Ward, are you saying Clara should decide for herself? Silas nodded, his entire body trembling from the effort. He picked up another stick, his hand steadier now, and wrote, knows her own mind. She's 12, Otis protested, but his voice had lost its conviction. Clara was already signing, her movements fast and excited. Nora watched, a look of astonishment spreading across her face. My God, she whispered. She says she's been teaching him sign language through the fence. Nora looked at Silas, a newfound respect in her eyes. She says he learns fast, because he already knows what it's like to live without words. This new information landed like a stone in a quiet pond. The sheriff looked relieved, as if this offered a simple, wholesome explanation. But Otis looked even more worried. This wasn't just a passing fancy. This was a connection, a deep one. You've been teaching him? Otis asked, speaking directly to his daughter, as if she could hear. Nora quickly translated. Clara nodded, a brilliant smile on her face. She began to demonstrate, making the simple sign for friend. Across the fence, Silas mirrored the gesture perfectly. She made the sign for horse. He pointed to sunset and made the sign himself. The proof was undeniable. A secret school had been in session at the edge of his property. But Otis wasn't having it. Learning or not, this is over. She has chores. She can't be out here playing teacher to a hermit. The insult stung, but Silas ignored it. He had to end this. He had to make them understand. He knelt and wrote something new, something that would change the entire dynamic. I pay for lessons. The offer was a thunderclap. Clara's face filled with hope. Nora looked intrigued. Even the sheriff seemed to think it was a reasonable solution. But Otis's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. His reply was low and final. My daughter is not for hire. The rejection was absolute. Silas felt the fragile hope wither inside him. He'd tried. He had used his voice, offered his money, and it wasn't enough. He stepped back from the fence, the darkness he'd held at bay for weeks rushing back in. But Clara wasn't finished. She walked over to the words Silas had written in the dirt. She knelt beside them. With a fierce, deliberate focus, she began to write her own message in the dust, her small finger carving each letter with painstaking care. The adults watched in stunned silence. When she was done, she stood up and pointed at the ground. Nora Harrow read the words aloud, her voice thick with emotion. I am not broken. The words hit Otis like a physical slap. His daughter, who he had spent his entire life trying to protect, to fix, was telling him he was the one who didn't understand. Here, with this silent, broken man, she felt whole. But before Otis could process this, before anyone could react, Sunset, the gentle mare, began to snort and paw at the ground. Her ears flattened against her skull. She was agitated, scared. Silas, the expert horseman, recognized the signs instantly. Danger. Then they all heard it. A low, distant rumble. a vibration in the soles of their boots that grew stronger with every passing second. On the horizon, a cloud of dust was rising, boiling into the sky, moving toward them at an impossible speed. The sheriff squinted, his hand instinctively going to his rifle slung on his saddle. "Stampede," he said, his voice grim. "Cattle. A big herd running hard." Clara couldn't hear the thunder of approaching hooves, but she could see the terror on every face. She looked to Silas, her silent question clear in her eyes. "What is it?" But he was already moving, sprinting toward the main gate, his mind racing. The herd was heading straight for the weakest point in his fence line, straight for the group of people standing frozen in the open yard. "Get back!" Otis screamed, grabbing for Clara's arm. She ripped her arm away from him. Her eyes were locked on Silas. She trusted him, not her father, not the sheriff. Him. The cattle poured over the ridge, a terrifying, unstoppable river of horns and hooves. They weren't just running. They were being driven, panicked by something unseen. Silas knew what had to be done. Someone had to get out in front of them, turn the lead steer before the whole herd crashed through the fence and trampled everything and everyone in its path. It was suicide for an amateur. It required a perfect bond between horse and rider. He swung himself onto Sunset's bare back in one fluid motion. Then he did the last thing anyone expected. He leaned down, reached over the fence, and held out his hand to Clara. "No!" Otis roared. "Ward, are you insane? She can't hear your commands." But Silas wasn't giving commands. He was offering a partnership. Clara had been studying him for weeks. She knew his rhythms, his movements. She understood his language of silence. Without a flicker of hesitation, she took his hand and let him pull her up onto the horse behind him. She wrapped her small, strong arms around his waist, holding on tight. "Clara, get down from there this instant," her father bellowed, his voice filled with panic. But it was too late. Silas dug his heels into Sunset's flanks. The horse leaped forward, turning away from the safety of the ranch and charging directly toward the face of the stampede. Two silent souls on a single horse, riding into the heart of the storm. They were about to find out if their strange connection was strong enough to save them, or if it was about to get them both killed. What Silas didn't know was this wasn't an accident. The stampede was a message, and it was meant for him. They rode as one. Sunset's powerful muscles worked beneath them, a living engine of grace and speed. Silas guided her not with reins, but with the pressure of his knees, the subtle shift of his weight. Clara, unable to hear the deafening roar of hooves, felt the rhythm of the horse, the tension in Silas's body. She moved with him, a perfect, silent partner. To turn a stampede, you don't confront it head on. You flank it. You become a part of its terrifying momentum, and slowly, gently, you bend its will. Silas brought them alongside the lead animals, a maelstrom of wild eyes and sharp horns. He held Sunset in a steady gallop, matching their frantic pace, letting the cattle get used to their presence. Then he began to angle in. Slowly, inch by inch, he urged Sunset closer, applying a gentle, relentless pressure to the flank of the lead steer. It was a deadly dance. One wrong move, one stumble, and they would be swept under, crushed into the dirt in seconds. Clara understood her role without a single word being spoken. When Silas leaned, she leaned. When he needed to create a larger presence to push the animals, she instinctively waved her arms, making them seem bigger, more of an obstacle. They were a single mind, a single purpose, flowing together in the heart of chaos. From the fence line, the three adults watched in breathless terror and awe. What they were seeing was impossible. A man who hadn't spoken in years, and a girl who couldn't hear were communicating with a clarity that went beyond language. They were a team. It took 20 minutes of grueling, heart-stopping work. But slowly the great beast of the herd began to turn. The lead steer, nudged relentlessly by the silent man and the deaf girl, finally shifted its course, leading the river of cattle away from the ranch and out toward the open range. As the last of the herd thundered past, Silas finally slowed Sunset to a walk, then a stop. The horse was lathered in sweat, her sides heaving. Silas's legs were shaking from adrenaline. He slid off her back, then reached up to help Clara down. Otis ran to them, his face a wild mix of fear, relief, and utter astonishment. Are you, are you hurt? He stammered, checking his daughter over, his hands trembling. Clara shook her head, her face beaming with pride and excitement. She looked at Nora and signed, her hands moving with a triumphant energy. Nora translated, her voice filled with wonder. She says they work together. She says she didn't need to hear. She could feel what he wanted her to do. Otis Clay looked at Silas. The suspicion, the anger, the judgment, it was all gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound respect. I've never seen anything like that in my life, he said quietly. The way you two, it was like you were reading each other's minds. Silas was too exhausted to write. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on Clara. Otis knelt down in front of his daughter. Clara, is this really what you want? To keep coming here? To learn from him? Her nod was emphatic. She signed again to Nora. She says she's never felt more useful, Nora said, struggling for the right word. She says out here her silence isn't a weakness. It's a language, and he's the only other person who speaks it. A long, heavy silence settled over the group. Otis Clay, a man of loud words and rigid rules, was finally, truly listening to his silent daughter. He stood up and turned to Silas. If I let her continue her lessons, he said, the words costing him a great deal of pride, I need your word that you will keep her safe. Silas met his gaze. He walked over to a clear patch of dirt and wrote, his letters firm and certain, with my life. That evening, for the first time in 3 years, Silas didn't eat his dinner alone on the porch. Otis, Nora, and Clara stayed. They shared a simple meal of bread and stew, the silence comfortable now, punctuated by the fluid movements of Clara and Nora's hands. As Clara was leaving with her father, she turned back and waved. Silas waved back. And as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, he did something he thought he'd forgotten how to do. He smiled. The next morning, Clara was back at the fence. But this time, when she unrolled her cloth bundle, it didn't hold a mysterious map. It held a small slate and a piece of chalk. Proper tools for a proper lesson. Their world had changed, but the danger that had sent the stampede their way hadn't vanished. It had just retreated into the shadows, watching, waiting. The men who drove that herd weren't just careless ranchers. They were the reason Silas's wife was dead. And now they had seen him connect with the one person who held a missing piece of the puzzle. Their lessons had just begun, and the real price of their friendship had yet to be paid. The days that followed settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. Each morning, Clara would arrive, not at the fence, but at the front porch, where Silas would be waiting with 2 cups of lemonade and her slate. Their lessons deepened. They moved beyond simple words like horse and friend. Clara taught him the signs for concepts: lonely, remember, afraid. And Silas, through simple drawings in the dirt and on the slate, taught her the language of the ranch, the difference between a mare and a gelding, how to read the clouds for rain, how to listen to a horse's unease with your eyes and hands. One afternoon, Clara drew something on her slate that made the blood run cold in Silas's veins. It was a crude, childish drawing of a windmill, but not just any windmill. This one was broken. One of its 4 blades was snapped in half, hanging down like a broken limb. There was only one windmill like that in the entire county. It stood on the desolate northern edge of his property, miles from the house, shattered by a lightning strike years ago. It was the place where his wife, Martha, had died. He stared at the drawing, his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked at Clara, a question in his eyes he was too terrified to ask. How could she know about that place? Clara saw his reaction. She pointed to the drawing, then pointed to her own head, her small face serious. She signed a single word, one he had just learned. Remember. But that was impossible. The official story was that Martha had been thrown from her horse during a sudden storm, a tragic accident. No one else was there. He had been the one to find her. Clara would have been just a little girl, living in town miles away. He took the chalk from her, his hand unsteady, and drew a question mark next to the windmill. Clara's expression grew troubled. She seemed to be searching deep within her memory, trying to grasp a slippery, fragmented image. She began to sign, slowly, piecing the memory together. Nora wasn't there to translate, But Silas understood enough. Car, noise, man, yelling. She couldn't describe the memory fully. It was a ghost, a half-forgotten nightmare from early childhood, a broken windmill, a loud noise, an angry man. She pointed to the drawing again, then made the sign for mother. Silas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Clara's mother, the woman in the photograph, had disappeared right around the same time Martha had died. The town had always assumed she'd just run off. Otis, in his grief and anger, had let the rumor stand. But what if it wasn't true? What if both women were at that windmill on that fateful day? Suddenly, Silas's silence wasn't about grief anymore. He realized with a sickening lurch that it had also been about fear. He had found something near Martha's body that day, something that didn't fit with an accident, a man's silver cufflink, half buried in the mud. He had picked it up, and in his shock and sorrow, he had put it in his pocket and forgotten about it until later. By then, the official verdict was in. An accident. He had convinced himself it meant nothing, that it had just fallen from some passing rider days before. He had locked it away in a small wooden box with Martha's other keepsakes, a tiny nagging detail he chose to bury along with his voice. Now it felt like a brand on his soul. Clara's memory, her drawing, it was a key. It unlocked a door in his mind he had nailed shut 3 years ago. The stampede, it hadn't been random. It had been a warning to stay quiet, to stay isolated, because he and Clara, by finding each other, were getting dangerously close to a truth someone had killed to protect. And the only other person who frequented that desolate stretch of land, who wore fancy silver cufflinks beneath his dusty riding coat, was the man tasked with upholding the law, Sheriff Wade McKinley. The next day, Nora Harrow rode out to the ranch alone. She said she was there to check on Clara's progress, but there was a tension in her eyes that told Silas her visit had another purpose. "Silas," she began, forgoing the slate, assuming he would understand. "Otis is worried." The stampede shook him. "He's talking about sending Clara away to a special school in the city. Somewhere safe." The word hit Silas like a stone. They were going to take her away, the one person who had pulled him back into the world. He shook his head violently, picking up the slate and writing. "She is safe here." "Is she?" Nora asked, her voice quiet but pointed. "That stampede wasn't natural. I grew up on a ranch. Cattle don't run like that without a reason. Someone pushed them, someone wanted to scare you, or worse." Silas stared at her. She knew. She suspected something more was at play. He took a breath and made a decision. He wrote on the slate, "Wait here." He went inside his dusty, silent house to the bedroom he hadn't been able to sleep in for 3 years. He opened a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Beneath a folded wedding dress, there was a small, ornately carved wooden box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, silver cufflink, tarnished with age and dirt. It was shaped like a wolf's head. He brought it back outside and handed it to Nora. Her eyes widened as she took it. She turned it over in her palm. Where did you get this?" He took the slate, found it, the day Martha died, near her body. Nora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Silas, this is evidence. Why didn't you give this to the sheriff?" He looked her dead in the eye, his expression grim, and wrote a single name. McKinley. The understanding dawned on Nora's face, followed by a wave of horror. "Oh my God," she whispered. "My sister, Clara's mother, Eleanor. She was a journalist before she married Otis. She was always investigating things, looking into local land deals. She thought McKinley was corrupt. She said he was using his power to force ranchers to sell their land cheap to some big railroad company. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture more ugly and terrifying than Silas had ever imagined. His wife and Eleanor. They must have been working together. They must have found proof. McKinley must have found out, Nora continued, her voice trembling. He must have followed them out to that windmill. Silas knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that McKinley hadn't just killed Eleanor. He had killed Martha, too, to silence the only witness. And he'd used the cover of a thunderstorm to make it look like a tragic accident. "We have to go to the marshals," Nora said, her mind racing. "We have to get out of town." But Silas shook his head. They had no concrete proof, just a 3-year-old cufflink and a child's fragmented memory. McKinley would deny everything. He would paint Silas as a grieving, delusional husband, and Nora as a hysterical woman chasing ghosts. He would use the town's prejudice against the silent hermit to discredit them completely. They needed more. They needed to find whatever it was that Martha and Eleanor had discovered, and Silas had a sickening idea of where it might be. He wrote on the slate, "The windmill." They must have hidden it there. Before Nora could argue, they heard it. The sound of an approaching wagon. It was Otis, and he was not alone. Sheriff McKinley sat beside him, a rifle resting across his lap. They weren't coming for a friendly visit. They were coming for Clara. "Ward!" the sheriff called out, his voice a friendly boom that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Otis has made a decision. He's taking Clara into town, for her own safety." Otis wouldn't meet Silas's gaze. He looked ashamed, defeated. "It's for the best, Silas. After that stampede, I can't risk it." Clara, who had been grooming Sunset nearby, saw the wagon and ran over, her face a mask of confusion and fear. She looked from her father to the sheriff, then to Silas, her silent question hanging in the air. "What's happening?" "Now, there's no need for a fuss," McKinley said smoothly, dismounting from the wagon. He took a step toward Clara. "Your pa's just taking you on a little trip." Silas stepped between them, placing himself directly in McKinley's path. He held up the slate, his message clear. "She stays." McKinley's smile thinned. "That's not your decision to make. She's his daughter. Now step aside." Silas stood his ground. He could feel the cold weight of the cufflink in Nora's hand. He could see the flash of a broken windmill in his mind's eye. This wasn't just about protecting Clara's happiness anymore. It was about protecting her life. She was the only living link to that day, even if she didn't know it. McKinley knew it too. That's why he was here. He wasn't just taking her away. He was silencing the last loose end. The confrontation stretched, taut and silent. Otis looked on, torn and helpless. Nora stood frozen, clutching the cufflink. Then Clara did something that changed the equation. She ran to the barn. A moment later she emerged, holding the cloth bundle she used to carry every day. But it wasn't her slate inside. She frantically unrolled it. It was a faded, folded piece of paper. A map, one she must have found among her mother's things. On it, in elegant handwriting, were directions. Directions that led from the main road, along the creek bed, to Silas's ranch. And on the map, one location was circled in red ink, the broken windmill. Next to it were 3 words that sealed McKinley's fate, McKinley's ledger. Here, the sheriff saw it. His friendly mask dropped, revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath. His hand moved, a blur of speed, reaching for the pistol at his hip. But Silas was faster. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't make a sound. He simply lunged forward and shoved Otis Clay with all his might. The surprised store owner stumbled backward, crashing directly into McKinley just as the sheriff was drawing his gun. The pistol fired, the shot going wide, exploding into the dirt. "What the hell?" Otis yelled, scrambling away. McKinley recovered, his face a snarl of pure rage. He raised the pistol, aiming it straight at Silas's chest. "You should have stayed quiet, Ward," he hissed. But he never got to fire a second shot. From the side, a length of heavy rope snaked through the air. A perfectly thrown lariat settled around McKinley's gun hand, cinching tight. Nora, the ranch-raised schoolteacher, stood at the other end, her face set with grim determination, pulling the rope taut with all her strength. The gun clattered to the ground. McKinley roared in fury and lunged for it, but Silas was on him, tackling him to the ground. They rolled in the dust, a desperate, silent struggle. McKinley was bigger, stronger, but Silas was fueled by 3 years of pent-up grief and rage. Otis, finally understanding, seeing the map, the gun, the truth of it all, let out a cry and jumped into the fray, helping Silas subdue the thrashing, cursing lawman. They tied him up with his own rope. As Silas stood, breathing heavily, covered in dust, he looked at Clara. She was standing perfectly still, the map clutched in her hands, her eyes wide with the enormity of what had just happened. He walked over to her. He gently took the map from her hands. He looked at the circled windmill, at the promise of a killer's ledger. Then he looked at Otis, at Nora, and finally back at his silent friend. He opened his mouth, and this time, the words came out clear and strong, forged in the fire of justice and washed clean by the truth. Let's go finish this. The ledger was exactly where the map said it would be, tucked inside a waterproof oilskin pouch and hidden in a hollowed-out stone in the foundation of the ruined windmill. It was all there. Dates, names, figures. A meticulous record of Sheriff McKinley's extortion racket, detailing how he'd forced ranchers into ruin and bought their land for pennies on the dollar for his corporate masters. The last entry was dated the day of the storm. It noted a final meeting with Eleanor Clay and Martha Ward, who had threatened to expose him. It was a full confession. By the time the federal marshals arrived, summoned by a writer Nora had sent, the town was in an uproar. The story had spread like wildfire. The silent hermit wasn't a monster. He was a hero. The deaf girl wasn't a nuisance. She was a detective. And the sheriff wasn't a protector. He was a murderer and a thief. Silas stood on his porch and watched them lead McKinley away in chains. The lawman's face was a mask of disbelief and hatred, his eyes promising a revenge that would never come. Otis Clay stood beside him. He put a heavy hand on Silas's shoulder. "I don't know how to thank you, Silas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For my daughter. For Eleanor's memory. I was a fool. I let my pride and my fear blind me." Silas just nodded. No words were necessary. Later that evening, Clara sat with him on the porch steps. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard. She leaned her head against his arm, a simple, comfortable gesture. She took out her slate and wrote a question. "Will you talk now?" Silas thought for a long moment. He looked out at the rolling hills of his ranch, at the horses grazing peacefully. He felt the comfortable weight of the small girl beside him. The silence wasn't a prison anymore. It was a choice, a peaceful space he could share. He took the chalk from her and wrote his answer on the slate. "Only when I have something important to say." She smiled, a brilliant, knowing smile. She understood. Their friendship wasn't built on sound. It was built on something far stronger. The silence was finally his again. Not a cage of grief, but a quiet garden where a new, unexpected life had taken root. He had found his voice not by speaking, but by finally having someone worth listening to. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of unlikely heroes and hidden truths. And let us know in the comments. What do you think was the most shocking twist in Silas and Clara's journey? Your support helps us keep these stories alive. We'll see you in the next one.